Hey everybody, Joanna here. Today I'm going to be talking about The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. This was my second Jimenez book, the first one being The Vanished Birds, his sci-fi book that was published in 2020. And both books were gifted to me from Evie from She Was Only Evie, and she had a wonderful interview with the author on her channel recently, so please check that out, especially if you've read this book in The Vanished Birds. But I have to say that after reading both books, that I think that of authors I've come across within the last 5 years, I think that Jimenez might be the best when it comes to modern fantasy prose. And I say the last 5 years, that way I'm excluding people like Guy Gabriel Kay, Janie Wirtz, Stephen Erickson, Susanna Clark, people who've been writing for a while and are still writing. But I think that Jimenez coming on the scene is coming out very strong with his two standalones as far as his writing is concerned. He has a way of giving you very immersive settings, adding a lot of layers to the story, in depth character work, and at the same time, keeping the prose feeling modern. There's a lot of forward moving action, there's a lot of depth without heavy description. And I think that that's something that a lot of people are looking for in their fantasy these days. So I'm going to go ahead and get into what's unique and interesting about this book and some personal feelings about it. But before I do that, I'm going to put this down. It's very difficult to talk about the story, The Spear Cuts Through Water, without talking about the structure. And there's a lot to say about the structure. But first, I'll just say that it is a story within a story, it's a framed narrative. So we have the outer story that is told in second person narration. So there is a you character, and the you character is what I infer to be a young male who's being told a story by his Lola, his grandmother, who's smoking. And the father seems like he's not as present. And I got the impression that there are other versions of this story that his father has told him, and that his father's interpretation of the story is one of violence and honor, and that the story his grandmother is telling him has a slightly different spin on it. And I don't want to get too much into that because I think it's neat to read it and find out for yourself. So we are trying to find out through this you character what this story that she's about to tell him is all about. And suddenly, as she's telling the story, the setting suddenly transforms into an inverted theater where the you character is sitting in a center seat, a body is shown on the stage, and then that inner story unfolds. I don't want to say too much about the inner story. I'll just give you the brief synopsis of it as it's given in the inside cover of the book, which is that there's a despotic emperor, there is an empress goddess that he is keeping imprisoned, and there are three sons called the Three Terrors, each having a horrific magical ability, and then there's the grandson named June, who is guarding his grandmother, the empress's body. And at the same time, he conspires with another guy who's named Kima of the Dwari tribe to help free his grandmother and help her plot to take down the moon throne. And there are still a lot of other things that are happening in this inner world, in this inner story. There are a lot of descriptive settings, a lot of insects and smells and fable-like aspects, including smoking apes and a network of traveling and talking tortoises who can read each other's minds. There's a lot going on in the story, but at the heart of it, I think, are these two characters who are trying to find their place in the world. And I think this is very much a generational story, especially one between fathers and sons, when the cycles of violence and the cycles and customs, the ways of being in the world don't quite resonate for these young characters. And they're left with this world that's in a state of horror, and what to do with it and what to do with themselves, how to find purpose, how to find meaning in the world when it's not given to you, and how to find connection, how to find an answer to loneliness. And as I said, the outer story is told in second person narration. The inner story, it jumps around between third person and first person. And there are some other unique things that Jimenez does on the page. He takes certain sentences and sets them aside in bold print for emphasis. And he also has certain passages that are italicized. And these italicized passages are told either from secondary characters or primary characters or from crowds of people in the world. And they break the third wall. I think it's the third wall or fourth wall, in which they're telling the you character in the outer story what they are feeling and thinking and experiencing in that moment. when their part in the story happens. So I think this gives voice and depth to so many characters in the story that might not otherwise be fleshed out. And because of these italicized passages and those bold printed sentences, I do not recommend this book via audio unless it's a reread for you or unless you are using a physical format and immersion reading. I know some people don't have a choice and they can only use the audiobook format, but if you're somebody who has the ability and choice to use a visual format, I would recommend going that route because otherwise you might miss some of the things that Jimenez is doing. There's a reason why he bolds certain sentences. I think he's doing this for emphasis. And I think it would be hard to follow along with some of those italicized passages I was talking about. And there are a lot of breaks in the story without breaks in chapter. It is told over the course of a few days, but I think that the way it's structured would be very difficult to follow via audio. I do have a couple of friends who listened to the audiobook of this and had a hard time. I know that's not everyone. Everyone's different as far as their ability with audiobooks, but I just wanted to go ahead and mention that in case it's helpful. And I also will say that there is a common element between the outer story, the frame narrative, and the inner story, which is the spear, as you can imagine. And so the spear hangs on the wall in the outer story. It's pretty much ignored except for the Lola, the grandmother character, bows to it before meals and has the you character bow to it as well. I'm going to go ahead and link below the Fantasy Thinker's prose video in which he describes a wonderful passage of the spear. Also, there's this element of dance that's woven into the story, both as a metaphor and as an action. So there are passages in which dance is actively used, but it's also used as a metaphor, I think, of what our generations pass down versus what a character uniquely expresses and brings forth into the world, which is, I think, tied into that larger theme of the story. So I thought that there were a lot of things to take in with this story, and it was really quite violent and action heavy, I have to say. And this is strange to say as someone who's a Baker fan and McCarthy fan. I found the violence a little graphic for me and a little difficult at times. I got a bit squeamish with some of the things that were described. I know that sounds strange. I don't know if I can really explain it. And at the same time, I wouldn't describe it as grimdark, though it is existential in some ways. In some ways, it actually kind of reminded me of the Neverending Story. Part of that had to do with the talking tortoise and the Empress, though the Empress is not childlike by any means and has a very different agenda. Also, in the way it does some interesting things with that framed narrative and inner story, the intersection between the two. I would say that in this particular story, the inner story felt somewhat allegorical for the outer story. And also, like the Neverending Story, I felt like there were parts of the world that had layers to it, had more story there without Jimenez feeling the need to flesh it all out. So I thought this was all very well executed. There was a bit of a change in tone towards the end, but it still felt like it matched the rest of the story at the same time. And I'll say for my personal enjoyment, I liked the book a lot, but I did not love it. I did not feel totally comfortable reading the book. It was hard for me to get grounded in the story. I reread the first 25 pages twice because I was having a bit of a challenge figuring out what was happening. And I'm usually okay with just rolling with things. But for some reason, I did. I felt like I had a hard time really grounding myself into the story. It didn't quite land in my heart as much as I had hoped. Though there were some shock gasp moments and some moments I really enjoyed and passages I really appreciated, it just didn't quite emotionally move me, and I can't really tell you why, but I'm so glad that I read it and that it's connecting with so many people, especially because it is so unique and so different. And I want to encourage that in the fantasy genre. As much as we all love our tropes in fantasy, and yes, there are probably some tropes that can be found in The Spear Cuts Through Water, it doesn't feel tropey and it feels like it's doing something totally different. So I just appreciate that innovation. I appreciate that Jimenez is playing jazz, so to speak, with the fantasy genre. That's what it felt like to me. And I guess that's all I have to say for now in a non spoiler way. But I am going to be in a spoiler filled discussion with Evie from She Was Only Evie. So please join us. I'll go ahead and link the details below that will happen this weekend. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.